Chinese President Xi Jinping is touring Africa this week as his resource-hungry country's influence on the continent soars. Analysts, though, warn that the all-weather trade friendship, while beneficial to Africa, should be more balanced. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Lucy Corcoran, who's an analyst at RMB. Lucy, having the president in South Africa focuses the mind again. We know that China's been interested in Africa for a long time. It's now talking about an equal partnership, and I'm not sure if the whole of Africa is equal to China. Certainly no individual country would be in terms of economic size. So where are we now? Give us the context for this relationship.
Well, it's really interesting. Obviously, in the last 10 years, we've seen a huge amount of growth in terms of the trade and investment flows between China and African countries. Last year, bilateral trade was about $200 billion US, and we were looking at about $15 billion worth of investment from China into Africa. These figures are sometimes a little bit muddy in terms of absolute clarity because there's a huge amount of difficulty in getting standardized figures, but it gives us an idea of the size of the kind of commercial relationship that we're dealing with. Also, what's really interesting is that Xi Jinping's tour to Africa is his first international tour after having been inaugurated officially as the president. He popped over to Russia just before the BRICS summit, but then he landed in Tanzania. He's currently in South Africa for the BRICS summit, and then we'll round it off with a trip to Congo-Brazzaville.
What are the issues that one has to watch out for here? Because it all sounds good on a big picture basis, more trade, more investment and so on. It does seem to be a residual anti-Western comment or view or attitude in some of the comment welcoming China. It's saying, we didn't like the colonialists and this is a different kind of relationship. Is it a different kind of relationship? Because, I mean, China is coming here not just to be nice, it wants resources. Also, it's doing things like buying land in countries to grow food.
I think there are a couple of ways of looking at this, and one of the key things to remember is that there is actually a lot of misinformation in terms of what China is actually doing. I think that in terms of what has taken everyone by surprise is perhaps the speed with which China's relations with other African countries has increased. What you have to remember is that China, obviously, yes, the principal motive, I suppose, originally was to increase access to natural resources, but China is increasingly seeing Africa and African countries as 900 million people in terms of consumers. And the difference here in terms of this accusation of neocolonialism is that whereas beforehand, particularly if African countries wanted to access international financing from the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF were pretty much the only game in town if they couldn't have access to private capital markets and the international capital markets. China's financial institutions such as China Development Bank and China Exim Bank have provided an alternative to many African countries.
Well, the natural question following that is the news yesterday of a new bank, a joint BRICS bank. Of course, how that will work out, and it's going to probably take years if they're going to set it up. China would be a leading player there. What difference is that going to make to China's activities?
I think here what's very interesting is that for one of the first times, Chinese financial flows will actually be coupled with other countries. Previously, China liked to go it alone and was very interested in bilateral interaction with African countries. This bank, from what we're hearing, is going to start off with about $50 billion US worth of seed capital, 10 billion of which will come from each BRICS country. So immediately that's a much more equal share, ensuring that no one BRICS country is going to dominate the agenda, as it were. But from what we've heard in terms of what South Africa has been saying and President Zuma has been saying, there is a definite shift towards trying to focus the BRICS Bank on development of infrastructure, not only in Africa specifically, not only because this will obviously benefit African countries, but it is also going to increase efficiency in terms of markets and in terms of access to raw materials.
You mentioned the $10 billion rather. That's a lot of money for South Africa, rather less of a proportion of bigger countries, particularly China. What's the price for this? Because China, in a sense, we need them more than they need us. Thinking of South Africa rather than Africa, or is that an unfair assessment?
I'm not sure about that. I think that a lot of the time when we look at the relationship between China and Africa, we focus purely on the economic side of things. And I think politically, there is a very important element there, both for Africa and for China, because China is very keen to promote its position on the international stage, not just in terms of its relationship with the US and its relationship with European countries, but also in terms of developing countries as well. And South Africa equally, one of the primary reasons it was so excited to join the BRICS Forum is the fact that South Africa can now punch above its weight in terms of this grouping with some very, very exciting dynamic markets.
Will we have to change some of the things we do once we get into that relationship? So now we're in the BRICS. One of our commentators from London yesterday said we were a bit fortunate to have got into that club. What are we going to have to do differently to play in this club?
That, I suppose, is the big question. I think one of the things that South Africa has to remember is that rather than playing to the fiddle of all the other BRICS countries, the idea is to bring an African element into this BRICS grouping, because to have a grouping of emerging markets that has no reference to the African continent at all is a massive oversight. Now, this idea of South Africa being the representative of Africa is very contentious.
Well, what does the rest of Africa feel about that?
Indeed, indeed. But I think that if South Africa, if we can manage that relationship effectively, and particularly if we can show material gains to other African countries, and here comes the BRICS Bank and the possible promise of infrastructural development, most of which is going to be very difficult to develop with private capital, because these are utilities, these are large-scale infrastructural developments that are generally in the ambit of public spending.
What about things like the allegations of dumping of textiles and Chinese cotton and so on? You know, many of the European brand names now have made in China on them. Are we going to try and protect our industry from this, or might that be one of the prices of being involved, is that we're going to have to accept those goods?
I think this is again one of these issues that you have to look at in a global context. One of the big challenges for South Africa coming out of apartheid was that we had a lot of industries that were no longer competitive, and it took us a little while to understand that whereas where we were currently in terms of a lot of industrial development, everyone else had moved a couple of decades ahead. And I think it's a very politically sensitive issue in terms of the textile industry in South Africa, given how many jobs were part of that industry and how many jobs we have since lost. And it is something that I think needs to be treated incredibly sensitively. But I don't think it's necessarily an issue where, oh, well, we just have to cut this sector and accept Chinese goods. I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of standardization, in terms of the optimization of value chains, specifically with regards to retailers and local producers.
Is there an element that we are grateful to have been allowed into the club, so therefore one perhaps might make concessions that you know, if we looked at our strategic relationship, perhaps we don't need to make?
Possibly. I think this is definitely the wrong approach. South Africa, now that we are part of this eminent grouping, we have to act as if, you know, we deserve to be here. And I think that if we don't do that, we run the risk of not being taken seriously within the grouping. There's obviously a lot of talk around the fact that from an economic perspective, South Africa cannot hold a candle to the other BRICS groupings. But there is a lot in terms of the normative side, the soft side, and in terms of the facilitation of African markets that we can add to.